Ed Gein case. In a quiet little town in Wisconsin, people thought they knew their neighbors. They thought they knew who was safe, who was strange, and who was harmless. But in 1957, inside one lonely farmhouse, police found something so disturbing that it changed American true crime forever. The man who lived there was quiet, soft-spoken, awkward. People in town saw him almost every week. He helped with odd jobs. He ran errands. Some families even trusted him around their children. To most people, he was just a strange local man. But behind the closed doors of his farmhouse was a secret so dark that it would later inspire some of the most terrifying characters in horror history. Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. All of them were partly inspired by one real man. His name was Ed Gein, and this is the story of the Butcher of Plainfield. Plainfield, Wisconsin, was not the kind of place people associated with horror. It was small, rural, quiet, a farming community where life moved slowly. Neighbors knew each other by name. Stores closed early. People noticed unfamiliar faces. It was the kind of town where parents believed their children were safe. And that is exactly why what happened there felt so impossible. Because when evil arrived in Plainfield, it did not arrive as a stranger. It had been living there the whole time. Ed Gein was born in 1906. From the outside, his early life looked like a hard, rural childhood. But inside the Gein family home, things were deeply unhealthy. His father, George Gein, struggled with alcohol. He had trouble keeping work, and he was not the strongest influence in Ed's life. The most powerful person in Ed's world was his mother, Augusta Gein. Augusta was strict, controlling, and extremely religious. She believed the outside world was full of sin. She warned her sons that people were corrupt, that women were dangerous. That temptation was everywhere. For most children, harsh words fade with time. But for Ed, those words became the foundation of his entire world. He grew up isolated from other kids. At school, classmates thought he was strange. He laughed at the wrong moments. He acted nervous around people. He did not make friends easily. And at home, his mother controlled almost everything. She was not just his parent. To Ed, she became the center of the universe, the one person he depended on, the one person he worshipped, the one person he could not imagine living without. As Ed got older, his world became smaller. His father died. Then his older brother Henry died under circumstances that some people later questioned. And eventually, Ed was left alone with his mother in their farmhouse. For a while, that was his entire life. Just Ed, his mother, and the isolated farmhouse. Then in 1945, Augusta Gein died. And when she died, something inside Ed seemed to break. He did not simply grieve his mother. He froze part of his life in time. He sealed off the rooms she had used most. Her bedroom, her sitting room, the spaces that reminded him of her. Those rooms stayed clean, untouched, almost like a shrine. But the rest of the house began to fall apart. Dust gathered, trash piled up, old newspapers filled the rooms. The farmhouse became darker, dirtier, more isolated. And Ed became more alone than ever. During the day, he still appeared normal enough to the people around town. Strange, yes, but dangerous. Most people did not think so. He worked small jobs. He helped neighbors. He kept to himself. He seemed like the kind of person people would describe as odd, but harmless. And that word would later haunt Plainfield. Harmless. Because at night, Ed Gein was living a completely different life. After his mother's death, Ed became obsessed with death. He read books about anatomy. He read stories about crime. He became interested in taxidermy. He studied newspaper reports. And over time, his obsession began to focus on deceased women who reminded him of his mother. Not young women, not random women. Women who, in his mind, somehow connected back to Augusta. Then Ed started visiting cemeteries. Late at night, under the cover of darkness, he would go to graveyards near Plainfield. He later admitted that he dug up recently buried bodies. He said he chose graves after reading obituaries. He looked for women who reminded him of his mother. This part of the story is one of the reasons the Ed Gein case became so infamous. Because Ed was not only a murderer, he was also a grave robber, and what he brought back to that farmhouse would shock even experienced investigators. But before the world knew any of this, Plainfield had its first major warning sign. In 1954, a woman named Mary Hogan disappeared. Mary owned a tavern near Plainfield. One day, she was simply gone. Investigators found signs that something terrible had happened, but Mary herself was missing. No one knew where she was. No one knew who had taken her. And for years, the case remained unresolved. But Ed Gein made strange comments. He would say things that sounded like jokes. He suggested that Mary was at his house. People laughed it off, because Ed was always saying weird things. And in a small town, people sometimes explain away strange behavior. They tell themselves it is nothing. They tell themselves that person is just odd. They tell themselves there is no real danger. But this time, the joke was not a joke. Then came November 16, 1957. That morning, a woman named Bernice Worden was working at her hardware store in Plainfield. Bernice was well known in town. She was a mother, a business owner, a familiar face. Her son, Frank Worden, was a sheriff's deputy. When Frank went to the store later that day, he immediately knew something was wrong. His mother was gone. There was blood on the floor. The cash register was open, and Bernice had vanished. But there was one clue left behind: a receipt. It showed that Ed Gein had been in the store that morning. He had purchased antifreeze. That small piece of paper pointed police directly to him. Later that day, officers went to Ed Gein's farmhouse. At first, they may have expected to find evidence. Maybe a weapon, maybe stolen property, maybe some sign of where Bernice had gone. But what they actually found was something far worse. When police entered the farmhouse, they stepped into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. The house was dark, filthy, packed with clutter. Old newspapers were everywhere. Rooms were filled with trash and broken objects. The air was heavy. The place felt abandoned, even though someone had been living there. Then officers searched deeper, and they found Bernice Worden. She had been killed. But the discovery did not stop there. Inside the farmhouse, police also found evidence connected to Mary Hogan. And then they found things that turned this case into a national nightmare. Human remains, skulls, bones, masks, objects made from human body parts. The details were so shocking that many people struggled to even understand what they were hearing. This was not just a murder scene. It was something closer to a nightmare hidden inside a farmhouse. And the man responsible was the same quiet man people had seen around town for years. The same man they thought was strange, but harmless. When Ed Gein was questioned, he admitted to grave robbing. He said he had visited cemeteries many times. He said he took bodies from graves. He said he was looking for women who reminded him of his mother. He also confessed to killing 2 women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. But investigators wondered if there were more victims. There had been other disappearances in the region, other questions, other fears. But police could only confirm 2 murders. And that is why Ed Gein's label is complicated. People often call him a serial killer, but technically, he was confirmed to have killed 2 people. What made Ed Gein infamous was not the number of murders. It was the grave robbing, the obsession, the condition of the farmhouse, and the terrifying connection between his crimes and his relationship with his mother. To understand Ed Gein, many experts looked back at Augusta. His mother had filled his mind with fear. Fear of women, fear of sin, fear of the outside world. And after she died, Ed did not move on. Instead, he became trapped. Trapped in grief. Trapped in obsession. Trapped in a distorted fantasy world built around his mother. Some experts believed he was trying to recreate her. Others believed he wanted to become closer to her in a deeply disturbed way. Whatever the explanation, the result was horrifying. Ed Gein was arrested. But when the legal process began, another question came up. Was he mentally fit to stand trial? Doctors examined him. They found that he was not mentally competent at the time. So instead of immediately going to trial, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. For years, Ed Gein remained in a mental institution. Then, in 1968, More than a decade after the farmhouse discovery, he was finally considered fit enough to stand trial. He was tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. The court found him guilty, but the court also ruled that he was legally insane at the time of the crime. Because of that, he was not sent to a regular prison. He was returned to a mental institution, and that is where he remained for the rest of his life. Ed Gein died in 1984, but his story did not die with him. In fact, the Ed Gein case became one of the most influential true crime cases in American pop culture. Writers and filmmakers studied it. Horror creators borrowed from it. And slowly, parts of Ed Gein's story became part of fictional horror. In Psycho, Norman Bates has a disturbing attachment to his mother. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface wears a mask and lives in a terrifying rural setting. In The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill reflects some of the same disturbing psychological themes. These characters are fictional, but the real shadow behind them was Ed Gein, and that is one reason people remain fascinated by this case. Because it sits at the intersection of true crime and horror. It feels like a movie, but it was real. The farmhouse was real. The town was real. The victims were real. And that is the part that matters most. Mary Hogan was not a horror character. She was a real woman. Bernice Worden was not a plot device. She was a real mother, a real business owner, a real person with a life that was taken from her. Sometimes true crime focuses so much on the killer that the victims get pushed into the background. But in this case, remembering the victims is important. Because behind every infamous criminal, there are real people who never got to go home. Plainfield changed after the discovery. The town that once felt safe became known for something unthinkable. Reporters arrived. Curious strangers came to see the farmhouse. People wanted to understand how something like this could happen in such a quiet place. But there was no simple answer. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Ed Gein was not a criminal mastermind. He was not charming. He was not powerful. He was not the kind of person people expected to fear. He was quiet, awkward, lonely, and deeply disturbed. That made the case even more frightening, because it suggested that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind silence. Sometimes it hides behind isolation. Sometimes it lives in a house people pass every day, without ever knowing what is inside. Eventually, Gein's farmhouse burned down. Some believed it was an accident. Others believed someone wanted the place gone. Maybe the town wanted to erase the physical reminder of what happened there. But even after the house disappeared, the story remained. The name Ed Gein became part of American crime history, not because he killed the most people, not because his crimes were the most organized, but because what police found in that farmhouse felt almost impossible to process. It forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people around us? How much darkness can hide behind an ordinary face? And what happens when grief, isolation, obsession, and mental illness are left alone for too long? The Ed Gein case is disturbing because it does not begin with a monster. It begins with a boy, a lonely boy, raised in fear, controlled by a mother he worshipped, cut off from the world. And after losing the only person he truly depended on, his mind went somewhere dark. That darkness grew for years, quietly, privately, behind farmhouse walls, until one receipt from a small hardware store led police to the truth. A truth Plainfield never forgot. A truth America never forgot. And a truth Hollywood would turn into nightmares for generations. But the real story is darker than fiction. Because Ed Gein was not created in a writer's room, he was real. His farmhouse was real. His victims were real. And the fear he left behind was real. So the next time you see a horror movie about a quiet man, a lonely house, or a dark secret hidden in a small town, remember Plainfield. Remember the farmhouse. Remember Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. And remember that sometimes the most terrifying stories are not made up. Sometimes they are waiting behind the door of the house down the road. This was the disturbing case of Ed Gein, the real man who inspired some of Hollywood's most terrifying monsters. Ending CTA. If you want more real true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Because the scariest stories are not always fiction. Sometimes they are real.